Assalamualaikum and hello everyone. Today we are from Group 5 would like to share about our topic which is risk management in food industry. But first of all, let me introduce my group members that consists of me, Ellysa, and Suriani and Islamiyah. Without further ado, let me share what is exactly meant by risk management. Generally, risk management is a process that involves identifying, assessing, and controlling threats towards an organization. The threats or risks could be from wide variety of sources, including financial, management error, and accidents. But in food industry, risk management acts as a tool and practice that must be implemented to ensure food safety throughout the whole production process. So for today, we will only cover risk management practice that specifically developed to protect against food safety danger. Here are some of the risk management objectives in food industry that we should aware for a better understanding. First, to identify and evaluate possible risks. Second, to reduce and eliminate harmful threats. Third, to prevent exposure of food illness. And lastly, to practice hygienic food preparation. Next, I will elaborate the standard and regulations specifically for risk management system. ISO 31000:2018 is a standard guideline for risk management and it is known as systematic application of management policies. This ISO 31000 provides guidelines on managing risks faced by organizations. The application of this guideline can be customized to any organization and its context. As example, ISO 31000 provides a common approach to manage any kind of risk and is not sector specific. It also can be used throughout the life of the organization and can be applied to any activity, including decision making at all levels. ISO 31000 is organized into the following main clauses, which are Clause 3, Principle, Clauses 4, Framework, and Clause 5, Process. Next, for your information, ISO 31000 describes a systematic and logical process during which organizations manage risk by identifying, analyzing, and then evaluating whether the risk should be modified or not in order to satisfy their criteria. This figure shows the relationship between risk management main clauses, which are principle, framework, and process. So this picture is a clauses file which is process that will determine the effectiveness of management. For your information, these three boxes, risk identification, risk analysis, and risk evaluation, uh, represent risk assessment. Next, here are the general principles of risk management. First, structured approach. Second, protection of human health. Third, transparent. Fourth, policy. Fifth, integrity. Sixth, decision. And lastly, integrative communication. Now, let's relate risk management with OSHA. First, you need to understand that risk management is the whole process of how you control the risk. And under risk management, there is a risk assessment as I mentioned in the figure before. So, risk assessment can be related to OSHA as it is a process where we identify hazards that have potential to cause harm. In OSHA, this type is known as hazard identification. So, this is why risk management and OSHA is relatable. This figure shows a hierarchy that emphasizes engineering solutions, where the top of the graphic are potentially more effective than those at the bottom. By following this hierarchy normally leads to the implementation of inherently safer system where the risk can be reduced. As you can see, elimination and substitution is the most effective at reducing hazard but tend to be difficult to implement in an existing process as it will involve major change in the equipment. While PPE are frequently used with existing process where hazards are not particularly well controlled. This method for protecting workers is less effective than other measures. So that's all for the general risk management introduction and also related regulation. In the next slide, my team members will continue to explain about risk management in food industry.
For the second part, next I will present about the risk management in food industry. So in food industry, the risk management is based on ISO 22000, which is the food safety management system. And in this ISO 22000, there are a few principles where the first one is to establish a food safety policy within the organization. Then the second one is to plan, design, and documenting a management system. The third one is to establish a team with qualified individuals to form a food safety team. And then is to implement a prerequisite program, follow the HACCP principle, establish a traceability system for identification of the product, and also to establish a corrective action. There are a few prerequisite programs that was established under ISO 20000, where the first one is a good hygienic practice or known as GHP, good agricultural practice, good production practice, good manufacturing practice or known as GMP, good distribution practice, and lastly is a good trading practice. But in this study, we will be more focused on the good manufacturing practice or the GMP. So in food industry, the Good Manufacturing Practice or GMP is defined by the Ministry of Health Section of Food Safety and Quality Division, and this GMP is functioned to elevate the level of standard of domestic food manufacturer in producing safer food. So to put it in simpler word, this GMP is used to control the production of food and to ensure that this food has a good quality that can meet the standard requirement. Next is about the hazard analysis and critical control point, or in short known as HACCP. HACCP is more focused on food industry, where it is involved the analysis and control of biological, chemical, and physical hazard during food production, where it is involved from the start during the raw material production, procurement, handling, and towards the manufacturing process, distribution, and lastly is the consumption of finished product. So in HACCP, all potential risks would be studied and the corrective action or control measure will be identified to ensure that the quality of the product will meet the standard requirement. There are 7 main principles involved in HACCP. The first one is to conduct a hazard analysis, which is the biological, chemical, or physical hazard, and then to determine the critical control point or known as CCP, to establish the critical limit, to establish a monitoring procedure, and then to identify the corrective action that should be made to prevent the risk or to minimize the risk, and then to verify the procedure, and lastly is record keeping and documenting procedures. So what is a corrective action? Corrective action is an immediate response that should be taken by a food safety team if the parameters has exceed the critical limit that was set earlier during the HACCP at any step of the food processing. And this will involve the identification and also the isolation of the contaminated food to evaluate its safety and also to prevent this unsafe food to be distributed to the market or to be consumed by the consumer. So this table here shows the example of the corrective action that can be taken during the food processing. So the first example is during the raw material handling. If there is any hazard that happen during the handling of the raw materials, what can be done is to separate the contaminated raw materials from the fresh raw material. This is to prevent cross-contamination to happen from the contaminated to the fresh raw material. And the second example is during storage. The correction action that can be taken is again to separate the batch to the other room so the other products will not be contaminated. The last example is during transportation and distribution. If there is any hazard that happen during this process, what can be done is to return this contaminated batch to the factory for further action, also to prevent this contaminated batch to be distributed to the market. Next is the documentation and record. So why is it important to maintain a complete and accurate documentation in food industry? This is to ensure an effective monitoring of the HACCP system and the demonstration of compliance with food safety requirement. So a good documentation should include a preliminary risk management, identification and selection process, the implementation of the control measure or the risk management, and then is to monitor and review.
I am Suriani and I will continue to discuss about the example on risk management based on ISO 22000. In our presentation, we mainly focusing on the food industry. So the example that I will discuss today is about frozen food industry. As listed is the phases in the production of frozen food. First, raw material handling, followed by pre-treatment, freezing, storage, and transportation. In this slide, I will discuss on how to fill in the HACCP form. HACCP system is a good approach to manage the production of high quality products since it focuses on preventing physical, chemical, and biological hazard during the processing stage. As shown in the slide, is the HACCP form that must be filled by HACCP team. The parameters involved in this form is the process, the process stages, hazard, which can be divided into three: biological, chemical, and physical, control measure, control critical point, and critical limit. So firstly, for the first process, which is raw material handling, uh, the biological hazard can be microbial contamination due to handling. For physical hazard, can cause by the direct contact between workers and raw materials. So the control measure is to wear table gloves during handling and packaging the raw material. For the second pre-treatment, it can found that the biological hazard is the survival of pathogenic and microorganisms. The chemical hazard is the contamination due to the chemical used in the pre-treatment. The control measure will be to control the amount of chemical use and required further pre-treatment to ensure that the chemical present in food is removed. Next is the storage. For the biological hazard is the multiplication of pathogenic microorganisms. The control measure is to adjust temperature based on the retardation of microbial growth so that the microbial growth does not occur. And the critical control point is the temperature and water activity. For the last process, biological hazard can cause the contamination of food product. The control measure is to ensure that suitable temperature is used during the transportation to prevent the microorganism growth. And the CCP is the temperature, water activity, and storage time. In this section, I will provide a more specific example on frozen food industry, which is in processing of frozen lobster. In, in this section, the possible hazards and control measure for each processing stages will be discussed. So for the first process is the processing and handling. Usually raw material will be stored in a packaging container with frozen ice gel. The possible hazard that can be found is the microbial contamination due to handling and the presence of rubber band or plastic stick on the lobster. So the control measure is to wear gloves during handling and pack the lobster separately. Second process is cooking. It is require continuous monitoring on online time and temperature. Possible hazard can be the survival of pathogenic and microorganisms and also formation of Listeria monocytogenes. And the control measure is to control the amount of moisture or water activity in the product. Next process is the cooling, which is the cooling process is required after the cooking process to cool the lobster with the ice bath. The possible hazard is the contamination of the product. So the control measure is to each batch should be prepped and handled using the separate equipment. For the next process is a meat extraction, which is to remove the lobster meat from the shell. The possible hazard will be microbial contamination due to handling. So the control measure is to clean the apparatus and equipment before process for the next batch. The next process is a primary packaging. Um, the product will be packed in plastic pouch or other container as a primary sealing. The hazard will be the microbial contamination during handling. So the control measure is to wear gloves during handling and use different equipment for each batch. Next process is pasteurization. To pasteurize the sea lobster at suitable temperature. This process can cause survival of pathogenic bacteria. So we need to control the amount of moisture or water activity that is available for pathogenic bacteria growth. So for the next process is final packaging and labeling. Usually final product will pack into master container, box, carton case. The possible hazard can cause from this process is error in labeling. So the control measure to create database driven label template. Next is the storage. This process need to be maintained a product temperature of negative 20 degrees Celsius or lower. The hazard is the multiplication of pathogenic microorganisms. So, in order to control this is to adjust the freezing temperature based on the retardation of microbial growth so that the growth does not occur. So the last process is distribution, transfer and refill the product. This is to transfer the lobster to retail or for purchase. The hazard is the recontamination of the product. So the control measure is to ensure that the temperature are below 0 degrees Celsius to prevent the growth of microorganisms. So as a conclusion, it can be found that in the production of frozen lobster, cooking parameters and freezing temperature are the most important key points to retain flavor, color, and texture of the lobster. To summarize, in order to ensure the effectiveness of risk management plan, monitoring, identification and evaluation of each production processes should be reviewed regularly. And whenever there are significant changes in the processing stage, risk management should be evaluated again for continuous improvement. That's all from our group. Thank you.